It's a wall.
Is that Yeah, I wasn't sure of the venue, and I was hoping they'd have a monitor, but why don't I think you all have the package I emailed out, so maybe we'll just work from that if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
I'll share.
We can share. Ray's got his thing.
Of course, I could have just pushed the button.
Yeah, you don't have
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, it's fine.
Stan says, would have printed a book? I know. Well, thank God his computer does what the printer does. Yeah, that's nice.
Sure.
So what I was speaking with Wendy about prior to today's meeting was to just spend some time and actually give you guys an update of where things are at. Obviously, the packet that we sent out.
Excuse me,
Yeah, sure.
before you get started
Yeah.
too much, we're having a little trouble with the audio because of the acoustics in the room. Just want to make sure that you're picking it up.
We're doing okay, just the background, a little bit of background.
Okay.
So that's really the issue.
I'll try to speak up so it gets on the record.
Okay.
The purpose of this discussion today was to give you guys an update as a planning board, an update of where things are at on the project overall. And I think probably as important as that update is also to talk about some of the next steps that are coming up, because we have some ideas about how we want to handle the next steps. And there's some logistics that need to be worked on, and there's some objectives that need to be defined, and we go through a little bit of the process. So this is a good time to sort of take stock to where we've got to this point, and then hopefully position ourselves for this next bit of effort. So just to give you guys an overall sort of summary of where things are at, we have at this point completed several steps in the project that we'd outlined originally. As you may recall, the project was constructed around 5 phases. Phase 1 being sort of data collection, Phase 2 being analysis, Phase 3 being issues and opportunities, and then the last 2 phases were to compile the document that would become ultimately the plan, draft in the final phase of that. The data collection and data project initiation phase was designed to establish the parameters for the project, establish some of the outreach and public engagement, which was obviously and continues to be a very big component of what we're trying to accomplish. Get base data together, get mapping information together, and all that. Phase 2 was the analysis phase, which was designed to sort of synthesize some of that information into something that we could use as a basis of understanding existing conditions and what things on the ground or what's happening on the ground. And then moving that into this next phase of issues and opportunities, which were to identify things that we felt were opportunities for you guys to make improvements, issues that we felt you should be aware of that could drive public policy or capital improvements for that matter. So on the project initiation and data collection phase, as the packet of information provided you includes, is a lot of the mapping information that we've been compiling. As you probably can see from some of that, we have been able, and through the efforts of our team, as well as in cooperation with many of the folks in Mark's departments, have been able to put together some pretty good information about existing conditions on the ground. Also, as part of that package we sent out was the preliminary traffic analysis data compiled by VHB as part of its President's Day weekend data collection this past year. And I can go into that in a little more detail in a minute, but that was the data collection for mapping, the data collection for understanding where trails are, where sidewalks are, what the status of the road networks are, was all very foundational to what we're trying to accomplish. We needed to understand that. And I think the data that we provided on those plans provides a good snapshot of that. We have a very good and robust data set to work from. No one on the team feels at this point that we're lacking a good physical understanding of the setting and the context and all those issues. Also, as part of that that project initiation data collection phase was some of the public engagement and survey data we've done. So that has included a number of stakeholder interviews, 17 or so stakeholder interviews. A lot of those have been with planning board members, which has been great. So there's been some consistency in that. That has ranged from conversations with organizations, departments of the town, individuals who have a contribution to make to the conversation around what should happen here. I think as I'll talk in a few minutes, we've got a lot of good feedback from that. And that stakeholder data, while we don't want to take any specific recommendation out of those conversations as gospel, does help impart some ideas about what the trajectory of things are, what the issues have been. And I think I'll explain in a minute, as you look at those sort of word cloud diagrams, a lot of very similar themes emerge as you sort of look at that graphic of words that people mention in their conversations with them. There's lots of phraseology, lots of individual words that seem to keep coming out in those conversations, which is actually, from our perspective, one of the things we wanted to see was, are there things we can build upon in terms of those conversations. So that was a big part of that effort. Another part of that effort, the first phase, was to do the initial survey. And as the data that we provided includes, we had over 600 responses to that. Obviously, that's as a percentage of we do not know exactly how many people it went to, because we relied on different organizations to distribute the link to the survey, the online survey. What we do suspect, though, is it went to quite a few, because those databases probably are fairly large. That being said, 600 responses is reasonable as a good foundation to consider that input. And I also would say that if you look at the way that data came out, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, there was a lot of really solid consensus around some of those responses. So there was pretty much not unanimity, but certainly large percentage of the respondents indicated certain things and answers in similar context. So I took that to bear as, we may not have the entire population dialed in, but we certainly have a very good representation of, I think, sentiment, which is really, at the end of the day, I think is what we wanted to get out of that initial survey. So those have been the main things. Additional to that has been some subsequent analysis that did not make it into this, is actually ongoing in a moment, of the transit part of that data set that DHB collected on President's Day. They've actually been doing a little bit more work with that data to understand the routes of the buses on that day, on that peak day, to understand where they were going, and I can talk a little bit about that as well. And then we also did a public outreach effort during Chowderfest, which was not hugely attended because I was competing with a band going on and chowder, for that matter. So there was obviously some of that. But I thought what was really, and I mentioned this to Wendy in one of our conversations following that, was what was probably the most important takeaway from that was whatever engagements we do going forward, whatever we want to do to actually engage the public going forward, it needs to make sure it addresses those weekend visitors that come here, those weekend owners that come up here, because I think they felt the ones that came to the table, came to the booth, we had about a couple dozen people come by and chat and talk and have conversations and such. Those folks were really appreciative of the fact that we were there on a weekend day and making an effort to engage them, because a lot of times meetings like this happen in the middle of the weekend, they don't get to see it. So that told me in listening to that whatever the next public engagement process is, and we obviously need to talk about that, it needs to be focused on making sure that there's some accessibility to it to those folks that come up during the weekends. Because, whether or not they are year-round owners, residents, they still have a significant input, I think, into the conversation about what the community should look like, and are part of that, should be part of that conversation. So we felt that was certainly a good takeaway out of that. Just a couple points here. The other thing that I thought was really important in that initial data collection phase was that we don't have any significant, I believe, any significant gaps in data at this point. I think between what VHB has collected and what we've got from the stakeholder interviews, as well as the survey, as well as the other sort of general conversations that we've been having, certainly planning board members and such, I feel at this point we've got a good, solid understanding of the context in which we're working on this project. That being said, the only area where we have had some challenge of data, of getting information on has been with the hockey group. They've been really inaccessible to us, even though we've tried to make outreaches to engage the hockey academy and get some feedback from them about their issues, their needs. It has not proven to be, hasn't happened yet. I don't think it's not necessarily too late. I think whatever works as we continue this process on, we can continue to try to make efforts for them and hopefully get them engaged in some conversations around where they see their organization going and how that might dovetail for the town's interests. But it points to probably just one data point that's a little bit weak that we hopefully can rectify as we move along. So just to kind of walk through a little bit of the data that we've collected thus far, and I'm going to start just by talking in broad terms about the context. So one of the things that we wanted to do as we put this project together is we wanted to build this ultimate report that we're putting together from the beginning of the process. So the way we're working is, as we're getting this information, as we're synthesizing this information, it's getting put into this document essentially, and that as we move through each of these phases and complete these phases, it essentially will be chapter, and by the time we're all done with the project, it will be, here's the big bow on it, and we're all done. Which I think is both a very efficient process to maximize the budget you guys have allocated for this, but also I think good because it helps walk everybody through this process in a methodical way. Given the size of the community and the intimate knowledge that a lot of obviously people that come here have, and get going into stakeholder discussions, I mean, everybody we talk to, and certainly this is borne out in the survey data as well, there's a lot of people that have been here for a long, long time. So we don't need to dwell too much, I think, on the context of the community. I think people will have a pretty good sense of that. However, we did feel it's appropriate and important that, as we're presenting the visual of the community, sort of showing the area, the rendering of the community, that the key places, the places that people recognize, are indicated consistently as kind of benchmarks, as kind of touchstones. So they always can see on the plans, for example, where Town Square is, and they can always see on the plan where the pond is, and so these iconic places that people recognized as part of the fabric of the community. So we're trying to do in the presentation of the data we're collecting is always use a consistent base plan, so that when you see the road network, it's on the same plan as this information about signage, and it's on the same information about sidewalks, and not changing scales, and not changing orientations, and not confusing people. And while this is good when you're reading it, when we do the public meeting, I think it'll be even more helpful because you can walk through all of these things in a series of plates, and people will sort of know where they are at all points in time. So the pond will be visible, and they'll always know when we're talking about this trail, it's in this location, which is good. The other thing we wanted to do was make sure we always had the focus was on the town and not necessarily on the mountain. And so obviously on our plans, the mountain actually doesn't show up. There's an arrow that says to the mountain, which is appropriate. But this is a project for the town. And I didn't want to sort of dilute that reality in the conversation here. Clearly, the road network and the connectivity of the mountain and the issues related to the mountain and the flow of people in and out is all connected to that. But I felt it was really appropriate as we're looking at identifying things the town can do that we work within the town boundary. So that was an appropriate thing. The only caveat to that is there's that little leg of the town that goes off into the left field there that sort of doesn't quite fit on the plan, but probably okay. I don't expect there'll be a lot of land use changes out there at this point. So that was another consideration in terms of how we organize ourselves. Just to walk a sort of overarching thing here through this. So one of the things is that the second plate, land use, what we wanted to do is reflect the zoning that you guys have established and color code it in a way that hopefully help people understand what the pattern was. And I can tell you that what's particularly good to see on that graphic is the fact that you have defined a core, and you know the core is defined, I think, adequately in terms of the land use pattern, and you have a pattern of residential surrounding it. And there is some new questions as to where that boundary should be drawn, perhaps in the future, to maximize opportunities for expanding commercial enterprise, or maybe you look at different use classifications. But in general terms, the land use pattern is something you would want. The only outlier in all of that is the fact that the town offices are not actually in the core. And we will talk about this in our analysis section at some length. But if you look at traditional New England development patterns, they are either developed around a church or a meeting house. That's pretty much how it happened. A church or a meeting house was kind of the starting point where communities sort of gathered around. Maybe a railroad or a waterfront or whatever else, but that was always kind of a hallmark. And one of the things I think the team has looked at is as you go forward and sort of try to maximize your opportunities as a community, recognizing the fact that the town offices aren't actually in the center of town is a little bit of a disconnect between what people's expectations are and what the reality is. And so that is something that we will highlight in our work as we move along.
Now, you want questions?
Sure, please.
Is that just your opinion, or did people in the surveys express that kind of?
That question
concern?
was not specifically raised in the survey.
Okay.
That is not. Yeah, that is our opinion. It's also based on sort of land use development patterns in New England, which is sort of a factual issue, and our it does provide a possible question for the next round of surveying, which we will talk about. Is it maybe one of those things that as we're identifying an issue, again, this is an issue we are identifying, it may be worth asking the question: do people feel that having the town office in the center of town would be a good thing or not?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean Public Works, for example, needs to be in the
Right.
town. But the idea of a civic presence in the core of a community is something that is historically is consistent. And I think it is just one of those, again, looking at this pattern that's emerged and sort of look at the flow of where things have happened, it just doesn't quite fit. Everything else from a land use pattern, I think the other thing is that we were struck by, and it's actually very encouraging, is the fact that you have a very robust open space pattern within the community, which is great. You have open space lands, you have dedicated lands that for open space, and obviously those are consistent with the trail network. We'll talk about that too, which is good. But it does mean that there are some gaps, there are some linkages that may need to be thoughtfully considered going forward. And one of the linkages, for example, is between the golf course and the pond, is making sure that there's some recognition that the connectivity there is an appropriate thing, and that whether that's defined as a trail that currently exists or whether that's maintained in some way through any future development scenario is, I think, an appropriate thing as part of the overall land use pattern that you established or trying to establish. That linkage of open space and connectivity. The other, obviously, the one of the big things was the transit data, and we were fortunate to get from the Mountain the sort of the bus stops that they currently have, and had many conversations with them about the transit system and sort of how it worked. And I can't remember who was with me. Was it Kat? Were you with me on that discussion with the Waterville? Yeah. I can't remember, it was been a while, but what was most striking in the conversation about the transit system were several things that came up as a result of that. First off, the number of bus stops was, and I think the graphic certainly points this out, was excessive. From a purely technical perspective, it seemed like they were stopping at an awful lot of places, and that cannot be efficient. That was one observation that we had. The second was the issue of the quality of those locations as stops, and there's quite a variation in the quality of those locations as bus stops. Some are very informal pull-offs, some are a little more established, and the lack of consistency there is certainly something that we observed as being an issue that needs to be probably dealt with in some way, because if you're going to build a transit system, having some consistency and experience is helpful, and some of that was borne out, I think, in the survey data that we'll talk about today. Some of the other takeaways that we had in terms of the transit data at this point was in conversations with how they operate the transit system. It seemed in some ways haphazard, to sort of coin a phrase. They would drive around and then make departures from the route if somebody wanted to get departed from the route,
That's right.
and then go on back, and sometimes we even heard stories about people just wandering off, driving off and sightseeing basically, and then getting back on the route. And I think one of the concerns that we've had as we're looking at that data is saying, okay, well, that's all well and good, but those compromises to the schedule then make the experience for those who may be trying to maintain that schedule, reduce that experience. So there was definitely some concerns about that aspect of it. So what's happening on that part of this conversation is we are actually looking at, in the identification of some issues and some opportunities, perhaps some alternative models for management of the transit system that the town can explore. And there's a couple, we're still working out all that actually at the moment, but there's some areas that we're sort of walking down. One of them is, do you maintain the way you guys manage? Do you maintain the current status quo in terms of relying on the mountain to manage the transportation system as a entity, status quo? Do you work with the mountain to define some performance standards and some objectives relative to the transit scenario you want to maintain and make that part of the relationship, so there's some more clarity as to what the expectations are from a community perspective? In terms of, we want to have, perhaps fewer stops, but these are the stops we want to have. We want to work on getting them identified. We want to get a route map put out. We want to do all these things that help clarify what the transit system's function is in the community. So that's another possible opportunity. And maybe on the more extreme side, depending on how you look at this, does the community take over the transit system and sort of invert the relationship with the mountain and say, okay, we're going to manage this because its function for the community is not simply as a conveyance for people to and from the mountain. It needs a broader role within the community as a way of getting around. And if that's the case, then maybe the relationship flips. Now, obviously, every one of those scenarios has pros and cons and benefits and costs and all that, and that's obviously something that we will have to provide you with. I can say that on the town control side thing versus the mountain control side of thing for transit, one of the potential benefits on the town actually running it is there may be other funding sources that are not available to the mountain as a municipality running a bus system. So there are some things I think that are worth, in terms of our analysis at this point, worth studying further and identifying as issues and perhaps opportunities, and then getting some feedback from the community on, because I think it is important. But looking at the survey data, the ridership level is not as high as I would have hoped in terms of people's use of it. It's it's in the 30 plus or minus % people sort of use the bus system on a regular basis, and I suspect, and the way the question was asked, may not allow us to get down to this at that point, but a lot of that was related to obviously the back and forth to the mountain. And even anecdotally, we heard a lot of people still don't use the bus system to get back and forth to the mountain because it's not convenient. It's not working out the schedule they want. It's not as flexible an option as they like. So I think there's definitely some room to continue to explore what the role of transit is in the community and how it might actually be enhanced in some meaningful way. And by all means, if you guys have any questions at any time, just stop me. We can make this a conversation. So the other aspect of beyond transit obviously was the roadway network, and I sort of skipped a section here. The transportation data from VHB, again, this is President's Day weekend this year. You know, whether that's representative of maximum capacity at the mountain, I don't know, but I certainly suspect that it's representative. We can certainly get in a calendar year, and ski season's notwithstanding, and this year wasn't the worst ski season we've ever had, so that's probably a good thing from the numbers perspective. Bottom line is your roadway system functions very well from a transit perspective, transportation perspective. I mean, they were fishing to identify any major intersectional issues, any capacity. You guys are operating about 46% of capacity, I think is the number, which is, you know, that's at peak. So you'll go today, it's probably operating at 5% or 3% of capacity. So, you know, there's no inherent structural issue with the road network in terms of its ability to accommodate the traffic that comes to town and to accommodate that traffic so that it flows well and that there's not long delays at intersections and that there's not a perception of being busy. Now, that does not mean that people do not have the impression that it gets busy. They do. And there's sometimes an emotional disconnect between what transportation analysis will tell you in terms of road condition and what people's experiences of road condition are. It's particularly true when you get into situations where you have an environment like this where the ambient level is so low because people's expectations are it's always going to be like it is in late July. And when the one day a year when all of a sudden you have to wait at an intersection for more than a couple seconds happens, it seems like it's worse than it is. But what we wanted to be, you know, obviously the analysis we conducted is using the standard methodologies for traffic analysis that you use in any community. So it allows you to compare a level of service, for example, which is a measure of that experience of a car at an intersection waiting to make a turning movement. A being exceptionally good experience, no wait time, easy to do, no issues. F being it's abysmally long, et cetera, et cetera. Every one of your intersections is operating at A or B for the most part during peak weekend. The only exception with that was the Triple I Road intersection. I think in the morning was D, but that was only for a very short period of time, the 8 to 9 o'clock hour. And again, that's peak day. That's like your maximum Easter Sunday situation. So, you know, the takeaway from VHB in that analysis and our work with them has been, you know, there's not much you could do about that particular challenge. I mean, it is going to be what it is because there's no intersection modification you can make to really enhance that as much. It's not like it's structurally worth investing a lot into it, or quite frankly. So you don't have an issue with the roadway system as it sits right now. Now, the only caveats to that are there are some things they identified for sightline issues, a couple locations. Tecumseh Road, for example, the intersect, Valley Road, Tecumseh Road. There's obviously some landscaping there that's been an issue. There's been some other Packard Road at the intersection. There's been some issues. Most of that was probably accommodated by some simple prescriptive management of the roadside condition and or working with adjacent landowners to deal with maybe some vegetation issue. Nothing that, at least at this point, that we felt was a big red flag that you have to structurally modify an intersection or anything. They had, the only other intersection that's a little bit strange is Snows Brook coming into Tecumseh, where the conference center is. That's a structural challenge because the way those three roads come together is just, not ideal. And we haven't finished our analysis of what that might mean, but the chances of actually finding a structural remedy to that are probably low, and given the volumes of traffic, it's probably not worth it. So it's one of those things where, you can look at something, with a magnifying glass and find an issue at any time you look. but this is probably not one that warrants a lot of public investment to repair and fix. The other, one other major aspect of this is that we've been looking at has been the sidewalk network, obviously, and sorry, I gotta keep skipping it. Let me go to parking first. So obviously we all know, obviously the main source of parking, community parking, is across the street, and that is and will continue to be an important aspect of maintaining public accommodation for parking in the core. It absolutely is essential now, and it is essential going forward. Survey data on the issue of parking felt basically almost unanimity that it was adequate. People did not feel, we asked point blank, did people feel like they could find a place to park? And they said yes. And which I was a little surprised about, because I've heard anecdotally, some challenges there, but apparently from the respondents we got, again, given the uniformity of the response to that question, whether or not everybody feels that way is not the case. I think that it's certainly indicative to me that most people feel that the parking is adequate. What is really, I think, also important as part of the parking analysis has been to look at where are those other parking facilities within the community's fabric that exist that perhaps provide some opportunities for other parking solutions on those occasions when normal demand can't be met, and this is things like events and sort of special programming that might go on. So obviously you have the conference center lot, you've got lots associated with the grill, you've got the overflow surface lot you've used in the past, you've got the lot over at the school. There are other places in the community that parking can be accommodated if necessary. And one of the things that, as we go through our analysis, we are going to do is look at make some suggestions on as an opportunity is to structure the conversation about parking going forward as the core evolves and develops, about making sure you're not ignoring the opportunity for shared parking in the community in a broader way. Because if you develop a good, solid transit system and it functions well, and you have that transit system connected to other opportunities for parking, you can then leverage those broader opportunities for parking in a way so you don't have to overbuild parking in the core. Our concern is overbuilding parking in the core and down the road is distracting from your opportunities for as a community to make sure you have space to accommodate the growth you may want to have. Unlike many other towns, you're in a fishbowl and you have nowhere to go. And you've built out a lot of the community already. So I think this is not something you guys are not familiar with. You have that sort of the one main piece that's undeveloped at this point, possibly some areas that can be redeveloped in the future if the market allowed, but you have a very limited area to grow. So how you manage parking going forward, I think, is going to become very, very critical. And I think as easy as it is to look at each individual project and say you must provide this number of spaces based upon your uses, I think given the scale of this community, you're probably in a more unique opportunity than most to look at sort of shared parking as a possible solution to some of those challenges. So if there are areas, for example, in the community that could expand parking slightly to accommodate a few more cars, and as they come down the road, maybe you get a few more cars in those areas, and other areas maybe you don't have to have as many spaces because you can take advantage of that. You have a very walkable community. You have a very community that can easily connect together with transit. So why overbuild parking at each individual property if you don't need to? And that's the thing I think we will provide you with more guidance on that as we get along in this in the issues and opportunities phase. But it's definitely one of those things that we've been seeing as a possible opportunity for you guys.
Now,
Yep.
just so I'm clear, most of the comments you just made about parking in the core were based on the survey data conducted this summer, or based on what you did back on Washington's birthday weekend?
Parking was based on the survey. We did look at flow in and out of the parking lot on the roadway. And again, it didn't seem like the numbers were not excessive for parking at that point in time. But the survey data was what really corroborated that comment.
Okay.
In your analysis of the parking, you just talked about doing shared parking areas as opposed to, say, a large parking area in one unit or one facility and then another large area for another facility. Do you have any kind of data based on your experience that you're going to be applying that says everybody will walk 10 feet from their car to get to an objective, but will they walk 100 feet or will they walk half a mile?
Yeah.
That you can kind of spread out.
Yeah, there are some standards. There's some not just standards. There are actually some real world examples of how this is applied. I mean, the general rule of thumb has been about 600 feet is your maximum. That's the comfortable distance somebody will get out of the car and actually walk somewhere.
So 90% of the people will walk 600 feet and then it starts to drop off.
Then it starts to drop off. Now, obviously, in winter environments, you got to apply a factor to that. So if it's not it's not summer. If it's Florida, that's different than it is in Vermont or New Hampshire. The other thing is, it also depends on what they're walking on. So if it's 600 feet of horrible trail or on no sidewalks along roadways, that's not necessarily ideal. So the idea of providing shared parking comes with a caveat, and that is where if you put it in locations where it's not accessible to people, it doesn't function well as part of this sort of minimum distance, then it's not going to work. So we would want to make sure, in terms of how you guys develop policy, if you guys choose to develop policy around this, that it's looked at as, for example, in the core, there could be some accommodation for shared parking. So you may not have one building is put up, for example, and it has X number of spaces of parking associated with it. 200 feet down the road is a parking lot that has extra spaces. Asking this building to build another 20 extra spaces now, while that parking lot exists, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because that is, as long as the connectivity is good, the distances are reasonable and all that. So it's kind of a change in thinking about parking as you apply it on a case-by-case basis.
How is that information going to be incorporated into the report? Is it going to
Well, we're going to use case studies to actually demonstrate some of these things, because I think it's really good for you guys to see how other communities have dealt with it, as opposed to just giving you, here's some suggestions. So, for example, what we'll do is we'll probably bring out some of our, we have some examples of projects we've worked on or other places we know of, where they've done a shared parking solution, and we can describe for you how they've done it, what the policy is associated with it, and how it's worked out. And I think that gives not just the planning board, I think the broader community of some real world examples. We don't want to just simply give you guys a chart that says you can have everybody walk 600 feet, you're fine. But I do think it's appropriate to say Mount Crested Butte in Colorado did it this way, and they did it this way because they had a very similar problem to you, and that is they had nowhere to go and they had very limited resources, and so they defined a parking strategy that reduced the requirement on an individual unit basis, because they knew they were going to be trying to maintain a shared parking environment. So when one business was busy, the other ones, they could sort of take advantage of collective parking in a better way. And I think you have an opportunity for some of that here, I think, going forward. You kind of have it now. I mean, the parking lot that exists now is essentially a shared parking lot. And it has allocations for lodges, has allocations for town square. So it's kind of doing the same thing. And it's not really any different than what you're doing now, but hopefully it's just changing a little bit of the way you guys look at it. So as new development comes in, you don't lose that flexibility in putting parking where it makes the most sense.
How does ownership of these lots come into play? Like, for instance, you got the Snows Mountain,
Yep.
you got 140 parking places.
Right.
As they build out, those parking places are going to be much reduced.
Yeah.
And that land belongs to the academy.
It does. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, as BBTS looks at expansion, and I know that they've been thinking about coming to you guys with some ideas for expanding, I think one of the things that we would suggest in terms of that conversation is, when you're looking at parking, you know, is that a location where some remote parking might actually be useful? And, you know, if in the future, if they can accommodate an extra 20 spaces in the development plan, or allow for that to happen at some point in the future, that's maybe not a bad thing to think about, because it does give you guys, as a broader community, a chance to take advantage of that. You don't control that land, no, but you can engage, I think, constructively in the conversation around, you know, can you, as part of your development plan, consider putting in some additional parking for events, because this is a location that might actually make some sense for them. That might be the exaction the community wants, as opposed to a sidewalk, for example. So a sidewalk from BBTS, you know, a portion of sidewalk in front of BBTS may not be the highest and best use for them from a public accommodation perspective. But adding 10 more spaces of parking so that when they're not busy in the summertime, and that lot might be, you know, connected via the shuttle, that might be very helpful for the community. So that may be an area where you actually get something out of it that you want, and don't get something you don't need.
Yeah, because, you know, that lot was definitely always used as a public lot, but now that it's privately owned and it's a school,
Right.
they could easily say, well, we don't want people.
They could, and I think with you know, it goes back to the conversation around, you know, they're not busy all year round. They have days of the year where the lot's not full, and that will be the case, I'm sure, going forward. They have days when it is, and obviously that would work out for them. But again, as you look at the overall interrelationship between all the parts of your community, that is one of those things. It's like, what can you guys do to help us as a community function better when it comes to dealing with events? Is there some way of like you said, it was a public lot, isn't anymore. It would be great to have access to that at certain times of the year, and how do we make that work? And that's part of the conversation.
And how does the town protect itself that there are some parking, that there will be? I mean, do we get easements? Because
Yeah, I mean, you can get easements, you can have agreements, the parking agreements, you can have,
Yeah.
you know, a number of different structures for defining those relationships, but it does come down to, I think, communicating a strategy to parking that actually starts to make this, it's not simply every entity for themselves. There is a overall need in the broader community to make sure that guests and visitors that are coming here can find a place to park when you're having those events that drive people in. And hopefully that becomes a good problem for you to have as time goes on.
yeah,
That you actually have, you know, you start seeing real needs for parking. And I think it's time to lay the groundwork for having those conversations. Now, obviously the mountain part of that too. I mean, you know, again, with a good transit system, if you guys did have a very big event, they got a lot of parking. And how do you deal with that? You get into, you know, relationship with them and talking about that. So skipping down to signage and wayfinding. So this is one of those dimensions of the project that we're looking at. And, I can tell you inside the offices of SE Group VHB, this conversation has been probably one of the more interesting ones, because you have a smorgasbord of signage and wayfinding in the community, and you know, we've sort of documented, I think, the main things that are out there, but a couple big takeaways from that. And this was borne out a lot in the stakeholder discussions. This came out as part of the stakeholder discussions. You know, what the community is really lacking at this point is a very well-articulated and consistent idea of its brand and identity. There are elements of it that I think almost everybody we talked to had in common. You know, the fact that this is such a unique place, and it's surrounded by the national forest, and it's the place at the end of the road, and it's so accommodating to those who come here. It's just such a peaceful place. It's like you can go outside and walk in the road and no one's going to hit you. And there's all sorts of elements that came out of that conversation. But every group, every sort of stakeholder group, whether it's trails people or the Silver Street folks or if it's the mountain folks or whatever, the lodges, all had a slight different twist on that conversation. And what sort of came out as a result of a lot of those conversations was, the signage system as it exists now really kind of reflects a lot of that disconnect of visual expression. There isn't any consistency on the visual side of the wayfinding system. Certainly, you have a varied palette of signs. The other thing that's probably more problematic is you don't have a hierarchy of wayfinding. So, for example, if you're driving into town and you wanted to find this place, that's fairly well accommodated. There's some signs that will tell you to keep driving along. But if you're in town, staying in town, and you wanted to find access points to some of the trails, good luck. You better know somebody, because it's not easy. There is not as much accommodation for a hierarchy of signs that actually goes from initial arrival, welcome to Waterville Valley, all the way down to you're leaving your lodge and you want to get on. You need to know where the Smartsbrook Trail. You have no idea where that is. You want to know how to get, which way do I go? So one of the things I think, again, one of the opportunities you do have is to look at the situation and use signage and wayfinding, I think, as a very good way of getting to the grand conversation for the community. I think it will be an invaluable tool for you guys to start having a conversation with the broader community about who are we and what do we want the world to know about us. Because signage and wayfinding is one of those things that can help communicate that oftentimes in a subtle way, which is effective. And I think it does point, and I think the hierarchy thing is also really important because we did hear from a lot of people about this effort to associate Waterville Valley with hiking is something that is ongoing as an effort of the Lodging Association and the Improvement Association. And I think it's also our perspective on that is it also is a unique take on the situation. You guys do have a unique physical setting, which would make your association with sort of the broader hiking opportunities really favorable, because you guys are sitting basically in the cradle of all this hiking on the National Forest, it seems like. And the fact that your signage system as it now stands doesn't really speak to that component as much as it probably should is maybe a lost opportunity and probably a good basis for conversation going forward. So signage and wayfinding is one of those things that we see as going to be a very pivotal part of the conversation, and hopefully, as a result of that, as a result of going down the road and looking at this issue, you can actually use it as a way to hopefully identify some elements that define what you think is your community identity and express that through your signage at different scales. One of the things we're looking at is analyzing is exterior lighting. Now, out street lighting basically. And Jim Mayhew was able to get us a map that showed us the locations of current street lights, and we're getting that information. We have that information in system now. We're trying to figure out how to model that so we actually can do what they call a photometric analysis, which would basically calculate the levels of lighting based upon the presence of these street lights. For two reasons. One is, anecdotally, we heard through the conversations and stakeholder conversations as well as other conversations that we've heard two divergent things. Communities overlit, communities underlit. Yeah, it's a matter of perspective, I suppose. But I think it's important for us to do in terms of providing you guys with good analysis to actually try to understand that more definitively and then make some comparisons to how other communities have dealt with it. I think general public comment on this is that they don't want the community overlit. They don't want it to look like suburban Boston. They don't want it to look like urban Boston for that matter. And that's fine. I mean, like certainly that to me that makes a lot of sense. There's no given the traffic situation and the condition of the roadways and the volume of traffic you're dealing with, there's nothing that would indicate that that's absolutely a necessity to make it lit like you would be in an urban setting. That being said, also my impression is that there are areas of the community that need some improvement on the lighting situation so that the pedestrian trail network functions more effectively when it's not light out. There's some safety concerns that now, for example, I think the trail along the river, for example, is a good example of a location where that as a conduit for people visiting the area to Town Square is actually great. It can function really well there. But do you want to be sending lots of people down there at 9 o'clock at night as it currently exists? Maybe there's some ways to improve that situation. The other thing that is actually obviously I think showing up, at least in the data we've seen thus far, is that where the lighting is actually happening is largely in the core. And I think at some scale, the community's got to get to a point where they can understand that actually makes sense as a matter of policy, is that if you're going to have a commercial core where you actually have your highest densities and highest likelihood of people being present at night, that the lighting level associated with that needs to be higher than it is in the edges of the community where that's not appropriate. Now that's not a carte blanche decision. That would be a situation where you would overlight it or make things, try to make it seem out of character. But it does. I think it is part of a recognition that with increasing density, with increasing activity, with increasing commercial enterprise, lighting has to sort of come along with that to make sure that you're providing visibility to those businesses and all those things that are appropriate, but also making sure that there's some accommodation for safety. And I think the analysis we will conclude with will get to that point. So sidewalks, and let's just go back. I think I skipped a little bit. The pattern of sidewalks and trails within the fabric of the town boundary, suggests to us that you probably have the right amount. Well, the area that's covered by sidewalks seems to be pretty good in terms of where people are and where people want to be. There's a couple exceptions though. Obviously, the Tecumseh Road connection would be ideal, and we know there's some issues with access for sidewalks to that along the roadway there. I think it's the village condos or whatever it's got some access issues there. But that notwithstanding, a sidewalk connection a segregated connection there to the main road would be actually helpful in terms of overall circulation. Outside of that, or and in these sort of side communities, do we need to get sidewalks on? I don't think any of us in our review felt that was at this point is warranted. There's no transportation reality for that, but there is there's adequate size of roads. The volumes of those roads are not high. People can walk, and they can be a share of the road situation for certainly pedestrian mobility. That being said, there are some of the secondary, the trail networks that work their way through the community that we feel really function as a secondary mobility network and may be able to be enhanced a little bit more to actually make them more viable as a secondary means of mobility. And the fact that Bridge, for example, is out right down here is an example of an opportunity to look at that not just simply as a recreational trail, but as part of the mobility network for the community. And I think that's something that we will be bringing out more and more as we get into our work, is making sure that you guys look at those trail connections, those year-round in a way, so that they can function as best they can as part of the mobility network, because it is kind of important.
The bridge across Snow's Brook.
Yeah, the one, yeah.
Whatever.
So that's an aspect of, I think, of the work that is interesting. The other piece of this, I think, is recognizing that we want to make sure the quality of the sidewalks and their maintenance and operation are consistent as much as possible. So that, for example, there are some locations where the sidewalk is along the roadway, adjacent to the roadway, and then there's some locations where it's been pushed back a significant distance from the roadway, and you end up getting a maintenance challenge with, roadway, a big wide grass, well, what you hope is grass, but oftentimes it's not grass, and then you get the sidewalk. And one of the things I think we're looking at is finding ways to sort of bring that conversation about operation, because it's, what's really important is, no matter what you have or what you want to have, is that you can maintain it in an effective and efficient way. Because there's no sense in having new sidewalks if you're not going to be able to maintain them. And there's no sense in having sidewalks that are hard to maintain. You're finding it really difficult to continue to have to put money into a particular segment of sidewalk because it's not functioning properly, not designed properly, then that's a big red flag as to maybe it needs to be relooked at. So there are some of that aspect.
Yeah, and in the report, will you be giving us some recommendations in terms of what would be the appropriate size of sidewalks that we would need for
Absolutely.
community size?
Yeah, and I think that's, so a couple things on
I
that.
think that's one of the things we're struggling with.
Yeah, sidewalk, certainly dimensional parts of this are appropriate, but I think the other thing is, we obviously recognize that I don't think there's going to be there's not going to be a broad recommendation for new sidewalks. I can tell you that. I mean, none of us internally have felt that there's really that much necessity, except for that linkage we were talking about, where it seems like if that linkage existed, it would be a good linkage to have. That being said,
$1 million before.
yeah, I mean, it's expensive, and whether or not you can do it is still subject to obviously conversation. But
Forest Service.
what's that?
Forest Service. Their stream. You're trying to get a bridge over that stream, you're subject to all of their, I don't.
The Forest Service doesn't own Snow's Brook Road, or Snow's Brook.
Trail?
Yeah.
We do. The town owns
Okay.
both sides of that. What we're gonna have to do is DES, because of the dam, there'll be some issues with how high the bridge has to be and things like that, but it has nothing to do with the Forest Service. It's gonna be the state. They can figure that out.
We
Yeah.
lost-
So the
we
point.
lost that bridge.
Huh?
We lost that bridge
Right,
on Snowy
during that.
Hollow.
Yeah.
So it would not be put back the way it was. It'll have to have clearance and all that, but I think those are things we can work with.
So the issue there is that will you need wholesale replacement sidewalks? No, I don't think that's certainly not going to be part of the recommendation. Will you need where there'll be some areas where in the course of time is it better to reconstruct them so that they're easier to maintain and maybe wider in some cases? Yes, I think that will be a recommendation, and we can give you some guidance on that. And this goes back to the point I was raising about like the BBTS as potential application. It's like as you're looking at new sidewalk expansions, for them, for example, is that actually strategic? Would it be better to allocate those resources towards some other segment of sidewalk? And that's that's something I think the town should consider. Is once you have this information in front of you as a sidewalk kind of strategy, is instead of putting sidewalks in places that don't make sense to have them, is it better to allocate those resources? And I think you talk to anybody about sidewalks, they're not cheap. The amount that you actually cost to build a segment of sidewalk is really expensive. But is it better to deploy that to reconstruct an existing sidewalk or expand an existing sidewalk? Maybe. And I think that's something we will definitely want to talk about.
Your conclusions, though, you say that basically the locations of the sidewalk are adequate condition and they have to be such that they can be maintained, but and Bill asked about dimensions and so forth. Your survey didn't find that the sidewalks, for the most part, are too narrow?
No, and they're not necessarily too narrow. There's a couple spots that are a little bit narrow, but the question is whether or not the biggest problem with sidewalks is the multi-use of them for bicycle and pedestrian mobility.
Right.
That was the biggest comment that came out of our review as well as on the survey data. There was of the concerns people expressed in terms of the use of sidewalks was, there's bicycles on the sidewalk sometimes. So there is an issue with that as a factor, I think, that plays into the adequacy of the width of sidewalks. So the question is, how do you deal with that? Do you widen sidewalks to make them more multimodal? So an 8-foot wide path would be a typical multimodal path width, 8 to 10, depending on volume. Or conversely, do you find and designate within the road network areas for better accommodation for bicycles? And while we're still crunching some of this data, again, given the road volumes here of traffic, there is no reason whatsoever, it seems, that there may be some minor exceptions to this, but there seems to be a very strong possibility that you could have a very good share of the road environment for bicycles and still make it, and still enhance that from a safety perspective. So whether that's striping, for example, the roadway so that the bicycles know they have a spot, or some communities they paint them bright green so it's very visible. But you don't have the volume of traffic that would instantaneously negate that ability. You don't have so many cars going down here to make that a compromise from a safety perspective. So I think that's an area where there's going to definitely be some, we can give you some good guidance on how that might be accommodated. And it does provide you, I think, with a way of reintroducing guests, visitors, and owners here to the fact that you can use the roads as a means for bicycle mobility, and we can find ways to accommodate them because they are, your roads are adequately sized. And I think it's certainly worth exploring that.
Part of the problem, I think, with people that visit, maybe for the first time or maybe a couple times a year, and the bicycle rentals that there's a lot of that, but some of those people do not feel safe on the road because of a lack of skill level. A lot of families are here and they're trying it, and it looks like it's a nice community to try it, and I'm a cyclist, but I don't know if in some areas having a bike lane defined however you want to do it on the road, if that would keep those people on the road.
You're definitely right. I think there's a perception. My guess is there's a perception you come here that it's like anywhere else. I don't want to drive on the road because it's not safe. Because the presumption is there's cars, and instantaneously, car plus bike equals bad, right?
A family with kids
Yep.
is, it seems like they're trying this out as a family, as a group bicycle ride around the valley for the weekend or something, or let's do that.
So one of the ways that might be dealt with is again, I don't think it's an all or nothing proposition, is that you have an opportunity to perhaps expand the usability of the road network for bicyclists, I think, by some relatively low cost solutions that help identify the fact that this roadway will function for bicycles. I think that's probably one of the most obvious issues. Is right now there isn't a visual identifier that says bicyclists are not only, you can use the roads, but you're welcome to use the roads, and we've actually provided some accommodation for you to use the roads, like signs that say share the road and striping that indicates that bicycles are part of it with bicycle icons on it, and all those things that you've seen in other places that really just tell motorists, hey, we're not in anywhere else. You got to think about this, which is part of the deal. The other part of that is there may be some routes, there may be some areas of sidewalk or trail where you could do things that expand those widths to allow for some accommodation for that situation you're just talking about. So it's not necessarily it's an either or situation. I think both could coexist as a strategy, where there may be one route or one segment of a route that is off road. You know, lets the younger kid who's sort of learning to bike the chance to bike, you know, in a segregated environment, but also provides some progressive opportunity for people that are going on, you know, here that might want to just ride around. And the fact is, again, it's happening now. I mean, just on the way in, 2 kids on their bikes on the road, and I mean, it's going on right now. But I think it really comes down to recognizing it and building some accommodation to make sure that people understand that that's actually not just something that they're doing, it's something that the community wants to encourage them to do, because it's a good thing. Going back to the signage wayfinding piece, it dovetails with that as well. You know, if you're going to allow and accommodate bicycles in various venues, whether they be on-road, off-road, or a combination thereof, the public wayfinding system needs to say that, so people know. This is a bicycle-friendly community. When you come in the door, you know, you're going to see bikes on the side of the road, and we want you to respect that. And
You actually find that term in a lot of resort literature.
oh yeah,
Bike-friendly community is a big deal.
well, and it's actually a program. There's actually programs
Right.
that community engage in to become certified bicycle-friendly communities. And part of that involves a lot of what I was talking about, is identifying routes, identifying accommodations for those things, and making sure there's bike racks that are visible at public. It's, you know, for example, when you come in, there's obviously a bicycle rack, and it's there, and all those things. And I think that's that should be part of the conversation that you guys want to get into, because again, going back to the survey results, even though you know, 80% of people bicycle up here, it's a very large number of people that actually, at least at some point in time, get on a bike. So you already are a bicycle-friendly community. You just haven't said that, and I think that's a consideration that can be made.
Did you get much feedback from the survey on bikes?
Yeah, you know, we asked a few key questions on bikes. I mean, obviously, we tried to understand you know, how many people use them in part. Again, a fairly large percentage of people use them at least occasionally. The concerns about safety were kind of what we suspected is you know, there's confusion as to whether or not the roadway is a safe environment or not. There was interactions with pedestrians. I think that was one of those things that people felt was, you know, a little bit of a problem. But in general, most people felt it was relatively safe. It was relatively a good environment to be in, and that was across all the dimensions. I think even, you know, vehicular, pedestrian, and bicycling. All people feel very safe here in general. I mean, you know, the answers to those. I mean, there wasn't a large percentage of people clamoring for concerns over safety. That didn't really register very high on the respondents. And again, recognizing that this survey went out to not just people that live here year-round. This went to people that come here. It went to seasons pass holders at Waterville Valley. So, you know, the resort. So it's like, that's people that come here occasionally, or summertime, or wintertime, or whatever. So there's not a lot of sentiment expressed in the survey that suggests there's huge safety concerns. I think a lot of this is in the margins of things. It's like, you know, it's being more visible so that if there's any inkling in somebody's mind as to whether or not this is a safe environment, that's dealt with. So put yourself in as you pointed out, as a visitor coming to town. If you were to come into town and immediately see green striped bike accommodation on either side of the road, signage that indicated bicycle-friendly communities, bicycle stops, you know, places where you park your bike. As you came in, your mindset's automatically changed somewhat as a perception. That's like, as opposed to, it's a road with a sidewalk. I think that's what we're seeing and suggesting. Again, going back to the stakeholder conversation, and I know that some of you from the planning board that were on them, I hope had the same impressions. I mean, they were very interesting and very informative, and I think there's lots of things we can take away from those conversations. But probably one of the most important takeaways from those conversations was the fact that the planning board needs to have more of those conversations. Because I think it really pointed out, having those conversations really gives you some sense of individual organizations, individuals, business owners, stakeholders, ideas about where things are going and where their concerns are and where their hopes are, really. And I found, again, I think there's a lot of commonality in the messaging around those conversations. Everybody feels passionate about this place. There is, this idea of mobility is a huge definer of the experience of people here. The fact that they can come in and let their kids walk unattended around the community. I mean, I can't remember how many people mentioned that as a defining characteristic of being here, as why one of the reasons they want to be here and actually come up here, whether it's for an hour or a day or a year.
Mark, can I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Sure.
For the planning board to have those meetings with those participants, the stakeholders, I thought was beneficial, but I also feel like there's been a disconnect with the stakeholders, that maybe they should become part of that combined meeting where it would be just the stakeholders and the planning board all listening and venting to one another and maybe coming down to a final point. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's some merit to that, but I think I would structure that perhaps not around an open-ended conversation, because I think we've had some of these open-ended conversations. All these stakeholder meetings were completely free-form in terms of no agenda, really.
Right.
The agenda was to understand what drives their motivation to be here, what their concerns are, what their hopes are, all of those things, which I thought was appropriate and really important to make sure you didn't come in there saying, okay, we're going to do a Rorschach test and we want you to, what do you see here? We wanted to really make this as open-ended as possible, and I think there was a lot of good feedback from that. The other part of that, though, is that there are some themes that have emerged out of this that I think are probably worth getting that collective stakeholder group together with. And one of the main ones is, and I've mentioned this, is this idea of who we are. Every one of these groups had a slightly different perspective on the identifier, the identity of the community, the DNA. What's your DNA? And I think it would be very interesting and helpful and probably worthwhile for the community at large to actually have this conversation about really what is our identifier. Now, part of this is, I think, again, based on the conversations with some of the stakeholders, has been that in the absence of a dominant force as expressed through the mountain, the community has now been trying to find its voice, and everybody's sort of working on its own, every group is sort of working on their own interpretation of what that might mean, because you can't exist without a purpose. It just doesn't work that way. So I think there's all this fishing around to try to figure out what our voice is in various groups, because the mountain doesn't dominate the conversation as it may have in the past. So in that context, this is probably the opportune time to get together, and the mountain needs to be part of that too. Can't be ignored, certainly. But there may be an opportune time to get back and say, well, let's find out what the Improvement Association is doing, and let's find out what the Ray Center wants to accomplish, and let's find out what the Waterville Company wants to accomplish, and let's find out what all these different groups want to accomplish, and figure out where the connection points are between those things. Because if anything from coming from those conversations, there are connecting points. There is as much divergence in conversation. There's also a lot of convergence in conversation, and I think you can't underestimate that reality, because it was palpable. Is that I didn't get the sense from any of those conversations that these folks wanted to see anything but success for the community down the road. Now, how it's measured, how it's defined, how it's realized may be slightly different depending on perspectives, but the commonality of actually wanting to become more successful, make this place a more resilient community that functions well no matter what the mountain's doing, I think was a common expression. I think there was a common expression of making sure that you become better at appealing to visitors. and being a place that's attractive to visitors. Because, you know, there's a recognition certainly amongst the stakeholder group that visitors are an important component of what you are. And not that you aren't good hosts, but you can be better hosts. I think that really, again, the overarching conversation was that, you know, you have a very unique environment here where people have lived here a long, long time. A lot of people lived here a long, long time. But you also have I think as the survey expressed, as the demographics from the survey showed, it's not everybody here is not from here, have been here for 30 years. You have a lot of newer people that have been coming here in the last 5 years or last 10 years. And so there's new interests and new information new thought that's coming into the conversation. And some of that sort of made its way into the conversation with the stakeholder members. I thought it was appropriate. So, you know, to your point, I think you raise a good. I would strongly encourage the planning board to continue to find ways to engage the community in that way, but structured around some things that are, I think, maybe more real. But I would start first off on the vision piece, because I think that is absolutely essential.
In your information gathering, is there anything about what people found visually appealing versus things that were not appealing to them?
In terms of architecture,
or just the overall general?
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, again, pulling words out of people's mouths in terms of those conversations and in the comments, we've got, you know, the scenic beauty of the area, absolutely critical. You know, the fact that you're surrounded by the mountains around you, and the visual environment is obviously paramount. And everybody said that. I mean, basically everybody said that. Everybody said that the sense of place here is palpable in terms of that. You know, that sense of isolation, but sense of strong community. You know, all of those things came out in this conversation. There wasn't a specific question, or I don't recall a specific response that indicated a certain architectural direction, for example, an expression architecturally. And if you look around, you don't have that. I mean, you have a very diverse palette of architecture, and you know, I'm not going to judge whether that's good or not, but the point is, I think there was nothing that was expressed that says everybody wants it to look exactly like somewhere else. But I did take away, and I think we took away from the conversations, that there is you know, recognizing the physicality of your location, you know, the setting is a really important piece of this. So as new things happen, considering those impacts are critical. We had a couple people, which was really interesting. So one of the things we did at the Chowder Fest was at a board out and asked people to put dots on it where they felt the most important, you know, where the spot in town that they thought was the most cool or interesting, or the one that sort of resonated with them the best. And then a lot of people put town square, a lot of people put dots over on the mountain, a lot of people put towns out elsewhere. But 3 or 4 people put dots at the cemetery. And because I asked them, "What's the cemetery for?" And they're like, "Well, it's a beautiful spot, and you can look out and you see the mountains."
It is.
It is. Absolutely.
You know,
Beautiful.
yeah. So I think that, you know, the point there is that, you know, I think for everybody that we talked to, and certainly and they expressed a lot in certain comments and stuff, was, you know, this idea of the visual environment that you guys are sitting in is something you do not want to lose. Good news is I don't think you're going to be able to. You know, realistically. Yeah. But the point, you know, perhaps more importantly, is making sure that that's part of the discussion around your brand and identity is actually really critical, and how you actually market the community, and how you actually, you know, tell people that who might want to come to visit here, you know, come visit here. The other thread, one of the other threads that came out as a result of a lot of these conversations, and certainly came out as a result of some of the survey work, was this reality of the role that BDTS, and to probably some degree the Hockey Academy, plays as the incubator for people to come here and gain a sense of this place. You know, whether or not they've been here before or whether they come up to ski once or twice, and then they get their kids enrolled at BBTS, and then all of a sudden next thing you know, it's 30 years later and they're on the planning board, right? And that was a really common expression of how people migrated here. Well, what does that say? Well, I think it tells me that fostering the collaborative relationship with people like BBTS is a really good thing. I mean, we talked to several of the real estate folks, you know, in terms of how they do their business and how they have the conversation with people that are interested in buying. And that is the cornerstone for a lot of their business. That fact that people actually want to buy it and actually have a place to be close to BBTS. So that doesn't mean you're all in on BBTS as the savior of the community, if you will. But it does mean it's like a college in a college town in a lot of ways. It's a love-hate, it's a love-dislike, whatever you want to say, like-dislike relationship, whatever. But it's sometimes a very difficult relationship. Sometimes it can be contentious. Sometimes it can be hard to see the mutual benefit. But it's definitely there. And that was a big thread that wove its way through our conversations, and I think it's important.
Other than BBTS, and you mentioned the Hockey Academy, were there other factors that you picked up in your conversations as to what drove people to come here?
Yeah. The other one that sort of rose up was the setting. The fact that you could come here, stay, and let your kids roam. And I think for a lot of, obviously you have the data. I mean, everybody from here is from Massachusetts, apparently. 80% of that. A few people from Missouri, but that's about it. And then, a lot of people came here from Massachusetts, obviously. And I think for a lot of the folks, and certainly sort of surveying through the stakeholder discussions, it was that unique quality of actually coming to a place that felt very safe and very accommodating and very accessible to their children. The fact that they can let a 10 or 12-year-old run up to town square to go to the store and they live down the road is a unique thing for a lot of these people, because they would never even think about doing that in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or wherever else. So I think that was a big thing. And going back to my point about those possible, the opportunities, I think one of the main opportunities, whether it's through signage or striping of the roads or some of the better lighting or combination of better trails or connectivity, is to just absolutely visually reinforce that reality. It already is safe. It already is. There's not a public safety concern with kids walking back and forth to the store here, but to go a little bit over the top to reinforce that as an expression of the community's commitment to making sure that kids can do that. So, for example, on the crosswalks, one of the things we're looking at is obviously the crosswalks. Now, again, if you simply look at traffic volumes, it doesn't make any technical sense to spend a ton of money on expanding the network of crosswalks, because there's a couple spots maybe it could be a little, better improved, the locations could be set better. We'll talk about those. We'll get those obviously evaluated and give some ideas for those. But as a visual expression, could you put in lights that people press a button and they flash and they let people cross the road, and it's an absolutely visual reminder of the fact that when you come here, your car is obviously, hopefully, the way you got here, but it's not the way you get around. And it could be another one of those ways of just reinforcing the notion that this is not, you're in a safer environment now. You've crossed you've trekked through the national forest, and now you're here. And I think there's certainly going to be we will certainly provide you some guidance and some ideas about that, because it seems to be one of those threads that wove its way through our conversations. It looks like the data, it might reinforce some of the reactions that people have to this issue of safety. if so many people are saying it's safe now, then what do you do to absolutely, dial that in?
Relative to that, Mark, you haven't mentioned yet, maybe you will later on, but have you looked into the traffic calming thing?
Yeah, again,
In
that's
connection with that, because of
Yeah.
course it only takes
And
that
that's-
one car
that's exactly the same situation. There would be literally no technical reason to calm traffic here. I mean, you'd almost have to give it adrenaline to get it to the point of being required to calm it. But again, it may be a situation where, in the interests of communicating a part of your brand, your community vision, you go a little bit more than you wouldn't have to. You go beyond what the standard is. Because, if putting in a better crosswalk or putting in some strips to slow traffic down, or to make intersections clearer as to, where people are stopping, if that is something that just visually reinforces the fact that pedestrians are going to be highly accommodated, and bicycles are going to be highly accommodated, and people on Nordic skis are going to be highly accommodated, then maybe that's worth doing. And I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, none of the traffic data would say, hey, you got to do traffic calming here because there's so many pedestrian crossings. Now, the one that was interesting, the one crossing point that was interesting, was up here across Valley Road over to that development across the.
This one?
Yep. And that one actually did in the wintertime. Again, this is February. We did some of the pedestrian counts. They did more people than I would have thought in an hour, like 20 or 30 people in an hour, which isn't a lot. And again, probably wouldn't classify as from a calming perspective as anything of significance. But it was more than anywhere else, and certainly raised my as I was looking through that data, going, what's going on there? And obviously what's going on there is people are coming here and then going there and doing exactly what we wanted people to do, is to walk to and from the core. So maybe that intersection you do something a little bit more visible. Now, the way that this will come about, I think, as we identify the opportunities, is it's not going to be a strategy for traffic calming and a strategy for pedestrian mobility and a strategy for wayfinding. It's going to be, here are some places where you can get all three things done at one time. Because if you hit all three of those notes, for example, then you're doing what we think is going to be a much better strategy, and that is reinforcing some brand proposition that you have with people that come and live here, and doing those things I was talking about, making sure that you're expressing that in a way that allows people to have connectivity and improve the signage situation so they actually know that. And so, for example, there are places like at the entry points to town where signage will become an important aspect, I think, of the recommendations. Doing something visible to let people know that they are arriving and that they are coming into this community and setting some expectations for that. But that in and of itself wouldn't be as strong if it wasn't accommodated by perhaps some improved bicycle accommodation, for example, or some improved lighting accommodation. And I think that's where we're going to sort of provide you guys some suggestions in terms of, identifying the overarching strategies and then identifying how those can be deployed at certain locations and then hitting all those sort of key points. Because, if you just did a signage plan, that would be okay. But a signage plan in the absence of actually identifying maybe some of those improvements in crossings or identifying some of those improvements in pedestrian mobility probably is less valuable. So, again, going back to the survey data, the overarching sort of conclusion. And one of the things that was interesting, there was quite a bit of people that actually had kids. 45% said they had kids under 18 that visit with them or stay with them. And the disposition of those kids were slightly on the older side, which obviously probably correlates a lot to the BBTS programs and such. But of those people that responded, 26% had kids at 6 to 10 years of age, and 14% had kids of 0 to 5% age. So one of the things that you should take away from that is that you may not be getting as much of the younger kids as you may have in the past. Obviously, we don't have any historical data to really sort of understand that at this point, but it certainly is something we've seen in other places where sort of developed communities mature over time, and the percentage of kids sort of wanes and the younger kids wane. Now, you actually have maybe have a hedge against that with BBTS because it's inherently drawing in families that have somebody in the program and they have siblings, and that's obviously a reality. You certainly heard that. So that's a good thing, I think, for a community like this, that you actually have something that actually draws places. And we've done a project recently for Quechee Lakes. It's a golf community, and they unfortunately have nothing like BBTS. So golf doesn't attract 5-year-olds to come, 10-year-olds to do it. So they have the opposite problem where they're having a challenge getting younger people with younger families to come in here. You actually have something that seems to be maybe ameliorating that potential concern. If you didn't have BBTS, would this place be older? Probably. I mean, that would seem to be my conclusion based upon some of these conversations and say that if you didn't have that draw of families coming here to get people into that program, would you be attracting younger families?
Does your, in your data, is it possible to break down the demographics of children for full-time residents versus
Yes.
Part-time residents?
Yes. Yeah. We asked both those questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be curious. Yeah.
The other thing which was interesting in the data set was we asked, what's their favorite season, when do they visit, that kind of thing. And you guys did pretty well in spring, considering, we work all over the country in resort environments, mountain resort environments primarily, and spring is usually like, Dogsville, but 22% responded, said they liked spring. And
Do they like it from afar?
they like it from their home in
Yeah,
Buena Vista.
I know.
But the point is that, but obviously the other thing, and probably more importantly, that spring obviously still was the lowest of all the seasons, but you actually had people who called out fall, winter, and summer. It was not all winter. And which is, again, I think is a huge advantage for you guys as a community, because you have people that want to be here in the summer. You have people that want to be here in the fall. That's a great testament to the fact that this is not simply a ski town. I think that's a really kind of what I took. We've asked a similar question, in lots of other places, and you ask this in Summit County, Colorado, which you see as winter, and then summer would be there. Spring and fall are non-existent, obviously, but you would have a very different reality there. So I think that we took that as an interesting takeaway in terms of the data.
Was there anything in the data about local towns coming to the community for whatever, whether it's an event or Corcoran's Pond or?
We asked questions about where they what they come to do. They asked about a very lengthy list of when you're here, what do you do, and all that. And obviously, events was one of the things that people brought people to the community. Obviously, the mountain was a significant driver of visiting or of interest here. Town Square was a big reason people come here. Now, we haven't broken down yet. We did ask some questions about where you're from, so we can get to that point if it's all people from Campton or Fort or whatever. But probably at this scale, I think what's probably most important to take away from that is that the things that are drawing people here are the things that you guys have actually invested in as a community. I mean, the mountain obviously is going to be a draw. Town Square is a draw, and it's partly a draw because of the events, and it's probably a draw because of the activities that go on here in the shops. So there's a lot that again, people are coming to stay here as visitors, they come here too. They get, this is where you eat, you gotta hang out, do all sorts of stuff. So there's definitely a strong pattern of diverse things of visitation. But what's interesting too is, again, the top ones were the mountain, the places that people visit when they're here. Mountain, Town Square, the athletic club, the hiking trails, ranked very high on that list. Restaurants, and the pond. I think those are the top ones. Hiking trail one was interesting to me because, again, that may be part of that opportunity to, if that's one of the things that people do when they're here, whether they're here year-round or they're here seasonal or for a week, that's important as a way of maybe visually reinforcing it or physically reinforcing that reality. Obviously, again, I talked about the fact that people drive here. 100% of people use their car, obviously. But the frequency of use for different forms of mobility, walking on the sidewalks was highly referenced. Walking on trails was highly referenced. Bicycling, everything, every form of mobility, with the exception of the bus. Bus was the lowest of all of the forms of mobility in terms of frequency of use of people that visit here. Which, again, I think bears out some of the opportunity perhaps that exists with the bus system. It's, if you don't know when the schedule is and you don't know when the bus will be there or where the bus is going to be, it does make it pretty difficult to bicycling, again, I think it's about 70%. Most people hold their bikes. I think that's where I was getting it. So that bike rental thing was only about 10 or 12%. So even though it's probably a very important thing for those who don't have it here, people are coming here and bringing the bikes in here. So the question then, I guess the next step is where, that's obviously kind of a snapshot of what we're even doing. We've done right now, we've collected some data. We're now in the middle of our analysis stage. Finishing that over the next 2 weeks. Our team is meeting internally next week to kind of go through a bunch of these things and put our opinions together with all our thoughts and threads and finalize some of the data we've got. And the goal would be to put out the analysis section of this document for you guys, sometime in the middle of August, so we can actually get it to you in sort of one formalized way. It will look a lot like it does now, but it will be fully flushed out. Still in draft form. We're going to keep everything draft until we're 100% final. The point is to get this out to you. The next couple of things that need to happen on the engagement is, we talked to you guys about the project, we really haven't about the fact that we want to make sure we can have as much engagement as possible, so that at the end of the day, both you and public development at least you heard us, listen to us, and I think we're making some strides to achieve that objective, but there are a couple other things that need to happen. One is going to be a second survey that we want to do. The purpose of the second survey is going to be for us to ask questions about some of the opportunities we're talking about. So those ideas I was talking about today about would things like striped bicycle ways along the road make sense? Would things like enhancing lighting on the trail network make sense? Would things like a bridge make sense? Specific things, and maybe some policy things. Sort of ask those questions of our distribution list and gets it through that. And obviously that's how we get appropriate. Ask those questions so we can actually get some public input. Now there's a couple ways. We originally had intended to do that in August, and at the end of August have our public meeting. And we talked with Wendy about the idea of doing the public meeting as a community picnic. We just did one in the Mad River Valley in Vermont last month. Had like 300 people show up, and it was for a project that was related to it, sort of economics in the valley, issues about that. And it came out really well, and I was really pleased with how it executed. And what basically the form it takes is try to keep it informal, try to keep it very casual and conversational. But you do a community picnic with food. You get people there and they can mill about and talk to their neighbors and hopefully meet some people they haven't seen in a while and have all those great conversations that go on. And then you sort of follow that up with a relatively brief, organized conversation, presentation of some of the information. So in this case, for example, what I would suggest we can walk through some of the highlights of the day, like the day, characterizing the existing conditions, get people interested in the day on that, and then spend some time talking about some of the opportunities that we've seen based upon the work we've done today. Put that out there as part of the conversation. And then you conclude that with something interactive, something that people can do. And what we did for the Mad River Valley project was we actually had a series of boards up on a wall that asked people to answer some questions based upon the information we had just talked about. And basically what it is was a continuum across the top that says strongly disagree, strongly agree. And they would come in and they'd put their dot, they'd get a packet of dots, and they'd put a dot on that continuum based upon their reaction to specific questions. And there's a whole host of questions, like 10 or 12 questions around the room set up. And they covered all manner of things. And here I think we cover all manner of things. Cover all manner of things. I think of all those questions on the team. But it was easy to do. They walk around with their brain, look at the questions, talk to the neighbor, and things like that. And what we did with that is we ended up get those boards back, and you almost get a visual impression of how people react. Because depending on the clustering of all the dots, you see a pattern. Everybody said yes to this, and others was good, and everybody said no, spread out across. So it's an interesting, very casual, informal, and effective way of doing it. I think that's a big success for Waterville Valley, is to do something similar to that, as opposed to a straight up, here's our presentation, and show of hands and questions, and then so we didn't take, I think one thing, to make it work well logistically, we didn't take specific questions from the floor at that meeting. You were going to come around afterward, and if you wanted to ask questions, they could do that. But we wanted to make sure that it was starting to engage the conversation and not become the conversation of all this stuff back and forth. Obviously, inviting people to make comments and participate as the process continues. The minute you start opening it up to lots of Q&A is the minute you sort of lose the ability to do it in a fairly constrained time frame. Think about it. Community picnic, you got an hour and a half meeting, queuing up, eating, finishing up, and then you've got maybe an hour and a half of presentation and conversation. That's 3 hours. That's probably a window of time. So, that would be our recommendation here if that's something you want to pursue. As I mentioned earlier, the other thing I would strongly encourage is and I think we were talking about on August 22nd, which is Friday, having it on a day that's more accessible to people who might be coming up to visit for the weekend. So, Friday evening, you let them know in advance, maybe you can they hadn't left her report early in August. Fridays in August, really, probably already up there at that point. You know, strong likelihood to be up that early. That would be a good time to do it because it does let you have hopefully a better opportunity to get some of those folks in, Tuesday. I'm not sure if you guys have talked about it.
We had talked about it previously. I think the biggest concern was how to handle budget-wise, because we weren't necessarily comfortable with asking for full-on donation from the 2-3 restaurants in town, and how that would affect our budget for the project. And Mark had mentioned that the planning board has a general budget we might be able to pull from. I think the biggest question was the financial.
Yeah, as I understood, the warrant town meeting was for 90.
Yeah.
Our budget is 84. For this project, our consulting budget is 84,000. And we're tracking, keeping obviously count present. We've been tracking, we're fine on the budget project. I feel like we're not any danger at all of any issue. We're actually doing pretty well where we're supposed to be, given, where we are in the work, where we're supposed to be is pretty well aligned. So it's not to exceed as far as we're concerned. So that's not the challenge issue. So I would assume that there's that, and I think this was purposeful in the construction of the budget, was to give you guys a bit of buffering to allow you to make some other, use allocation of that resource in a way you felt was appropriate. And if enhancing the public engagement process by making it a little bit more interesting, i.e. a picnic, a little bit of a give back, I think it's a good thing, then I suggest we did this morning.
Why don't you do it on a Friday versus a Saturday or Sunday, when one of the things that you brought up earlier was capturing more of the weekend evenings and really giving them the opportunity.
Well, it came in, part of the reason that it looks like it's Friday, the 22nd day course at this point, a couple reasons. One is obviously schedules on our side of the equation.
But sorry.
The other thing was that we did talk, there's an event going on that weekend.
And people participating in the event, is that 5K craft beer thing, theoretically would get here, in time to participate.
So, I mean, as I've looked at your guys' event calendar, weekends are pretty busy. Yeah. So, finding a spot that actually was free and clear was probably not going to be possible anyway. So, Friday may not be the ideal circumstance, but if it's a Friday evening, 5 o'clock on Friday or 5:30 on Friday, we did the Bad River Valley one. People left work and came up. They don't have as much seasonal visitation for, weekend visitation. So that made more sense. But we still did it after work hours, so people left work at 4:30, got there at 5:30, and it went to 8:30. And it could have gone to 6 to 9, I think, summer evening, it's not time. So in this case, I'm not sure of the time, but I think it's 5 to 5:30, something like that. Hopefully you'll get some of those folks to come in already, and if we can let them know soon, if this is a go, then they can make a decision. Let's go a couple hours early.
And you had put a press release out to the Wigwag too that included that, so to help start the process.
Set that in motion. I was going to give you details about where and when, and time for the video. So I think it's certainly meritorious of some investment. Now it doesn't come out of our budget. Now we hadn't anticipated feeding the town. I had scope of that, scope of work, but I think it's certainly, and I would hope that the rec can be able to work collaboratively with the restaurant folks in the way.
Yeah.
Some of those would be a great marketing, I tell you.
I spoke with Sean Stout and Tom Gross, and they both immediately said, "Oh, set up grills," and they're enthusiastic about it.
Yeah,
but,
the only advice is we used to do the WBAI picnic
Right.
on Labor Day, which is getting very close. It's going to be cold and dark. You're probably going to have to go indoors. I don't know if we start at 5:30, 6 o'clock, we're going to be able to do it outside.
Okay.
I mean, it's getting late in the season, and I know that's the problem they ran into with the picnic. Is you just got too dark.
Is it possible that, I'm not sure, is there any place to set up at the rec center?
I had asked Rachel, and she said, because we needed a rain location, and she had said that that could be available for a rain location.
Right.
So
Is there
maybe
any
it
outdoor
could just
space
be,
associated with the rec center that we could use?
Yeah,
there's like the playground.
right next to it, there's a play area.
Well, there's some benefits to that in the sense that if it's, say there's, I'm guessing here, but say it was near the rec center, you could set up an outdoor area in case the weather's nice. You could then have the meeting, the presentation part inside.
Yeah, that could make sense.
Like a start, so you got a benefit of letting people
Yeah.
have the picnic
The
part
only,
outside.
the only downside to the school is there could be no alcohol.
Well, that is a big downside.
And there's definitely no
It's an
alcohol in the
alcohol-free
school.
zone when you go
Right.
alcohol.
No.
How about it at the rec? Can there be alcohol there?
No alcohol in the school, anywhere in the school.
On the
property.
campus.
How long do you have to take, how long does it take to change the bylaw?
Well, it is a safe community, so you can't, no alcohol is allowed, it's an alcohol-free zone.
What about
Yeah, we can go to a mountain.
Eating outside and eating there.
Yeah,
Right here?
Center, I'm sure
Yeah.
there's other
Okay.
things that.
No, this could work too, I think, that would be, as long as it's available.
What, this?
Yeah, well, this one.
Weddings might be an issue. Yeah, weddings.
Oh, the weddings, that probably are.
Well, I guess we'd have to check.
So I think, it's definitely worth, I don't know, I don't know if it's something that.
Well, we can do it, you can do it at town hall, I mean, clear the police and fire days there. And we've done that before, and that works, they have equipment for picnics there, and that's enough room. And there you could have alcohol.
They had grills.
Yeah, sure. Set up grills there, right? The police grill there.
Yeah.
What about?
Oh, yeah, there's a grill right outside of when we enter the planning board.
Right.
It's right there.
What about the athletic center?
Well, it's private, so,
Yeah.
we'd have to get permit, it's not town property.
Yeah, for as an example,
Oh, because of the construction still going on.
Flatbread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pavilion, it was a private enterprise, but again,
I love
let's say that
flatbread.
the community is not just made up of the town, it's like.
Yeah,
private
you
enterprise.
could
Right.
ask
Might
them,
be
and
interested in
we
doing
could get the
that.
Coyote Grill to provide the food, sure. I mean, we
Well,
can
he
afford it, I'm not worried
he
about that.
has offered to,
Yeah, I mean, we can find the money.
yeah. Sean and Tom has offered to.
Yeah, BBTS.
Well, that actually might be, yeah, that's
Oh.
good.
I don't know if they allow alcohol.
Yeah,
I think you're gonna
yeah.
check with them.
I think we have had alcohol over there when in their opening. Didn't they have
Just
wine?
check with them.
In their
I've heard
opening-
some events they do not, and that's why I
Yeah.
said that.
They're private.
They may not.
You don't even need to be certified as a teacher. Why do they care about alcohol?
It's not a permit, it's just a personal. You can't be 50 people together and all.
No, I mean I don't think they have to follow.
But the other thing with
It's a
that
school.
is they're not
Yeah.
happy with us right now.
So, the
Promote
issue with
school.
the picnic.
Really? Oh, I wasn't there.
Neither was I.
The issue of the
Because-
picnic notwithstanding,
Ray said that they
we
came
still
in,
are
and the plan
obligated
that
under
they
the way
brought
the
in
scope of
was the
creating
same plan they had
a public
submitted
meeting.
prior to
And,
the
I do
the
think,
training
feel
center,
strongly that
and
doing
they
it in some way
rejected
that
it.
is a little more
Planning board rejected
I agree
accessible
with you.
would be a
It's a whole
good thing.
different
And hopefully give the
application.
planning board a little more.
And then I
You know,
also
the
found
ideal
that
situation, you
they're
guys
not
all be
happy
there
with us parking.
as part of
They're
that
using
picnic
parking
park,
facilities.
having those interactions.
It's getting
with
down to nitty
conversation.
gritty now.
There'd be some information up on the wall that would talk about things, and then they would,
Good
you
relationship.
could.
I think it's important, but I also think that we should put all our
Talk
eggs
about
in
the
the
different facets of the work and ask those questions afterward. And I think it just gives
The
a,
hockey academy, they'd be a little more compliant with us.
sets a tone, or reinforces a tone for hopefully setting people that we are interested genuinely in understanding more about their concerns and hopefully finding ways to deal with them. So and then here we are at the end of July, not a ton of time. So a decision about the picnic probably needs to be made pretty quickly so that it can be accommodated.
But in terms of getting back just to the report itself, you will address in there, not, at least alternatives as to what we might consider for transportation?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
As well as the changes to the parking in the central area.
Yeah, every one of these facets I just talked about, sort of, sidewalks, trails, transit, signage, wayfinding, land
Okay.
use, all of those things we will provide some analysis to,
Right.
and some issues and identify some issues and opportunities. So just kind of checking down through the things we've seen thus far. Land use, the location of the civic core, town hall, is a issue. That we think there is perhaps an opportunity for transit, that spectrum of potential ownership models that might make sense, and maybe some changes to the routes and sort of coordinating that. That's what we're working towards, is developing what we think are going to be good, solid recommendations supported by case studies that you can see for all of those facets that will give you guys guidance as you move this.
A few things that I think you should add on this final draft, and that's something about bike routes and maybe the crosswalks.
Yep.
And please put the library on there.
Yeah, the bike routes are actually, it's actually funny. It's handled, and it's going to be handled under the analysis for sidewalks and trails, but it may warrant its own
Yeah,
section. And then crosswalks obviously comes in under that as well.
yeah. And can you add the library building to the key?
Yeah, I think we actually put the rec center. G, elementary school and rec center. Oh, the library, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The library trustees are
Yeah.
a little upset. And is the second survey going to include any talk about the gondola that's been proposed?
I don't know. The gondola that's been proposed is certainly probably needs to have some vetting out there. I mean, it's certainly one of those things that did come up. We did not ask any questions about it specifically in the first round because we were trying to assess existing conditions. It is an opportunity, no doubt, and it is an opportunity that probably merits some conversation. I think the concern I have, it will come down to the questions around it, because if it's not provided in enough context, I think it's going to be very confusing to people. The idea, okay, would you get back and forth to Mountain on a gondola? If you ask that basic question, I can answer the question now, probably. Yes, people would probably choose that as a positive. But I think what really comes down to the question needs to be asked is are there, how you get to the mountain now, based upon how you get to the mountain now, whether it's by taking the bus or if it's driving, what are the things that would influence you to not take your car? I mean, is it location of the point of where you're going from to and from? Is it cost? Is it the form of mobility? And as part of that, maybe you get into the question of using a conveyance, like an aerial conveyance. But I think it can't be simply yes or no question. It can't simply be because I think in order to really evaluate the overall viability of that as a thing down the road, this provides us an opportunity to ask some of those foundational questions that might help us understand what the form that needs to take, as opposed to just saying it's a gondola. Like, for example, cost. If you say, how much would you spend to get back and forth to the mountain? $2 a round trip, $5 a round trip. Those kinds of questions can get to some of the, we can answer that question maybe in a different way as opposed to just coming out and saying, would you take this gun? I do think it's appropriate to find some way to ask the question. I just have to come up with the right phrase, right thinking around it.
Were you able in the surveys to get any data relative to usage by day of the week?
No, we did not ask any questions about daily use of anything. The questions were asked around when you're here.
Just when you're here. it's not like, when are you here? I mean, like, you know, am I
We
here
did-
only on the weekends, am I
Right.
here only,
Yeah.
you know, on
We
vacations?
did, we did ask people about whether they're here short-term, long-term.
Yeah,
You know, we have some information about that, but not specific days of the week, you know, utilization. That's a little fine-grained, I think, for a broad survey like this. You know, it would take a long time for somebody to do that.
well, I know one of the questions that we wrestle with is, you know, is there anybody here from Monday to Friday? You know, particularly in the winter. Is it all just weekend traffic now? Is it just holiday weeks? I mean, I don't think we know anymore. I mean, we suspect, you know, based on, you know, eyeballs, that there aren't a lot of people here from Monday to Friday, particularly in the winter. But I don't want to say that unless it'd be nice to have some data.
Well, it's certainly something, you know, we can, the purpose of the second survey.
Yeah.
You know, we can take things not learned from the first one and try to apply them to the second one.
In the summer, it seems there are more people here sometimes during the week. But it's hard in the winter because nobody goes outside. So you can't see anybody anyway. But just based on attendance at the ski mountain, you would suspect there aren't a lot of people here.
I mean, if this flows like what you would expect.
Well, because I think it impacts a lot of decisions around building transportation systems and the rest. What are you trying to build for?
Yeah.
No, yeah, well, and I think
You know?
that, you know, going back to some of the preliminary issues and opportunities identified. I mean, again, I don't know if we're going to provide you with a laundry list of significant capital improvements that are necessary.
Right.
Because, you know, a community like this that is influenced by a resort, as you are, and we certainly know from there's a reason we did President's Day weekend as part of the traffic data collection, because we knew that was Easter Sunday, you know.
Right.
And in some ways, your system has to adjust to that peak. It has to deal with that peak at some level. If as a result of that analysis, we've identified all sorts of structural modifications that were necessary to deal with the circumstance, then I think the question you ask is a really good one. Is okay, we can't simply build this for peak. We gotta consider the broader.
Right. You got to run it for choice.
Right.
And you know, or what do you do? I mean, we struggle with that. I think it's a town because the troughs can be awfully troughy.
Right. But I'm saying what I'm trying to sort of communicate is that, you know, if you had identified in the peaks real structural problems,
Right.
then understanding the impact of you know the relationship to the troughs becomes even more critical, because it gives you you know, how much is it worth this investment if it's only going to serve us for 3 days a year, right? But as I said, I don't think you have any major. Nothing major rose up in terms of the traffic analysis that would suggest you need to do those sorts of things. So the question becomes is, are the enhancements you might pursue things that improve the general quality of life that have value troughs and peaks? And in some ways, some of the things we've been talking about probably disproportionately benefit the people that live here year round. Because they will be, you know, for example, if you have better segregated sidewalks, you know, segregated bike lanes and stuff like that, that presumably will benefit people that are here more often because they'll take advantage of it. So I agree. I think it's probably worth asking some questions about that pattern of visitation. Maybe getting a little more grained on that as we go through this next round. But I think it's appropriate also to understand that, you know, what value that might help us understand is probably not as critical because of the absence of some of these real, you know, needs for huge structure. Like all of a sudden, if you need intersection lighting or roadway geometry changes to accommodate turning movements, if that had come out as a result of some of the traffic data, then I'd be like, yeah, we need to understand the cost-benefit analysis. That needs to relate to how often is this actually happening. But finding levels of service of A and B on your worst possible day, you know, at every intersection you've got. And actually, that's one of the interesting things about this traffic study. you're probably the only community I've ever worked with where we've actually analyzed, I think, almost every intersection in town. Most of the time you just sort of pick the main ones and you sort of, you do your pattern around the main ones. But this is like almost every intersection was looked at some level. And so I think as far as understanding what's the flow of circulation, at least on that day was, probably got it pretty dialed in that weekend. And again, nothing came out of it that said, big, huge structural change, which is good. I wasn't expecting to see something like that, just from my impressions here, but it's nice to actually see that that's the case. Are there any other questions? So I'm not sure how the planning board wants to sort of pursue. We are committed and dialed into being available to you on the 22nd, and whatever form that meeting might take. And obviously we'll work as collaboratively as we can to make sure it's done the right way.
We'll send an email off to you with the final conclusion as to what the community picnic will. Okay?
Yep.
I'll talk to Wendy and we'll send it off and let you know and finalize everything.
The only other order of business that I had that I wanted, so we do have a winner for the raffle that and I need to let them know. I want to make sure the planning board was okay. Is it Linda Tibbet? I think is the winner.
Were we going to do 2 winners, or are we going to do 1 winner at the end of all of our surveying?
We said we were going to do 1 winner for this survey, so we can do another winner for the next one, perhaps. And the only reason I wanted to, just before we booked and shipped her Kindle Fire tablet, is make sure she wasn't a town employee or something like that. Obviously that would not go over very well.
Is she from Waterville? Do you know?
I don't think I know.
Yeah, I don't either.
It generated a random number and it said number of whatever it was and Linda Tibbet. That's the one that came out. So
Don't recognize her name.
she's not on, as far as you guys know, she's not on the planning board.
No.
That's probably good. It wouldn't have looked good if one of the planning board members won. So
we just have to do it again.
I will draft up a response and send her a congratulations email and figure out how she wants to get her gift. Is that it? Is there anything else?
Maybe we should put that winner in the wigwag or something so people know that somebody did get it.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Good idea.
I'm going to write a wigwag thingy, so after you give me her name, and just say, so I'm just going to write congrats, or congratulations, but congrats to winner of the survey raffle, is that what we're going to call it? Winner of
Community survey.
community, thank you.
The more time you say it, the more people will believe it.
That's right. To whatever, and the name is?
And I think it's Linda Tibbet, but I don't know.
I have to know how many B's and T's.
Yeah, I know, me too. I will, actually, I emailed it to Wendy, right? I think.
All right, I'll tell Wendy
Maybe
to get
someone
in
can
touch
email
with you.
Tina, and just so that way she has the spelling exactly
Okay.
Tell
right.
her to email me, because it could be,
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, we don't want to
I
mess that
think
up.
it was Tibbett, but I'm not.
Tina, what's your
What's her
email?
first name?
Tina,
Tina.
Oh, that's
Tina, at the, T-H-E, Coppels, Koppels,
Koppels
correct.
Okay.
.com.
.com?
Yes.
You got it,
And
okay.
where does she live, Linda Tibbet, just so,
We don't know.
let me know where she, of
Anytime you would
Massachusetts.
say, yeah.
Of
That's a
what?
good guess.
Yes, I thought so. Of Missouri.
Yes. It was funny, I was looking at that data with the Missouri contingent.
Yeah.
It was like 5 or 6 people that responded to Missouri.
I'll do that, I'll try to tell them to do that all in caps too, so it.
Yeah.
So
All right.
that's up to David.
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very
Mark.
much.
That was informative, thank
Very
you.
interesting.
And if anybody obviously has any questions on the materials and other things, by all means, let me know. I think, I can have specific questions about, the data we've got, okay, as you can well imagine, 600 survey responses, with whatever 30 questions, I think is the ultimate number of questions. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of ways you can look at the numbers and such. We're trying to do at least, I think, for the first surveys, try to keep it as broad as possible.
Yeah.
We wanted to get a broad sense of the community. We wanted to make sure that we weren't isolating all the respondents. This is the answer for residents and this is the answer for non-residents. Too much. Although that information is available to us, and if we need to look at it, we will. We can. But as we move forward, I think it's appropriate to make sure we continue to have that data available to you, so you can parse it out a little bit more if you need to, sort of to understand maybe there's some policy implications of things. I mean, if you guys decide that there's going to be if you guys agree that moving forward, the town office should be located in town square or, in the town center of town. That has policy implications that need to be addressed. And that's differently handled depending on whether or not you are resident or not resident. So I think it does make a difference in terms of that. So we will continue to ask that question so we can parse it.
Mark, quick question. Do you have a meeting with the committee next week? Nancy's, no meeting.
I thought you had said something about it.
Okay.
We're meeting next
Okay,
week.
just
No.
No, okay, that's
I thought
good.
you had mentioned it.
Okay.
And I think, like I said, this stuff will be, we're obviously continuing to work on it. Hopefully Tom is still working on it right now, so having to make some changes. So, this will be continuing to evolve, and I guess our goal is to actually have this information in draft form still, but for the presentation on the end of August, to make sure that this information in some form can be communicated.
The planning board will get that a little bit ahead of time. So
Yeah, I'll make sure you guys get at least a week ahead of time.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Just one more thing on the agenda was privilege of the floor. Have a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
May I have a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.